Good afternoon, and welcome to our fourth event in this speaker series on global digital rights challenges, brought to you by the Promise Institute for Human Rights and the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. My name is Michael Karen-Nicholas. I'm the Executive Director of the ITLP, which is a new research center at UCLA, whose mission is to foster research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable. The Promise Institute for Human Rights is the center of human rights education, research, and advocacy at UCLA, which empowers students with enriching teaching and experiential opportunities in human rights law, engages with diverse frameworks and disciplines to generate new thinking on human rights, and advocates for change in coalition with academics, practitioners, and activists. They focus their work on 5 main thematic areas, including migration, race, the environment, accountability, and technology. I will start by acknowledging on behalf of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. And with that, I am delighted to introduce our speaker today. The theme of today's session is on misinformation and synthetic media. We have an incredible guest to talk about this. Sam Gregory is Program Director of Witness. Sam's current work focuses on the threats and opportunities as emerging technologies such as AI intersect with disinformation, media manipulation, and rising authoritarianism. An expert on new forms of misinformation and disinformation, as well as innovations in preserving trust and authenticity. He leads Witness's Prepare, Don't Panic work on emerging threats such as deepfakes and on new opportunities such as live streamed and co-present storytelling for action and curation of civilian witnessing. He's on the Technology Advisory Board of the International Criminal Court and co-chairs the Partnership on AI's expert group on AI and the media. From 2010 to 2018, he taught the first graduate level course at Harvard on harnessing the power of new visual and participatory technologies for human rights change. He's spoken at Davos, TEDx, Wired, and the White House, as well as many other festivals and universities. Sam has an MA in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, attending as a Kennedy Memorial Scholar, and a BA from the University of Oxford. Today, Sam will be in conversation with 3 current Promise Institute fellows. Annie Setien and Nick Levson are rising 3Ls at UCLA School of Law. Aya Dardari graduated with an LLM from UCLA Law in May 2021. All 3 are spending the summer researching the regulation of mis and disinformation on online platforms, and I'm very much looking forward to what I think will be a fascinating discussion. I'll turn it over to Nick to kick things off.
Thanks, Michael. Before we start, I just want to encourage members of the audience to drop any questions they might have for Sam in the chat, and we'll try to work them into our conversation or address them directly. So welcome, everyone, and thanks again for joining us, Sam. Your organization, Witness, describes itself as a leader of a global movement that uses video to create human rights change. To start us off, would you like to give the audience a brief introduction to Witness and its activities?
Thanks, Nick, and thank you, Michael and Jess, for the introduction of the chance to be here. So Witness is a human rights network. We are a team distributed around the globe that works to help people use video and technology for human rights. What that practically means is a number of things. One level, we work very closely with communities who are trying to use that intersection of video, mobile phones, the mobile internet, social media for human rights change. And that's on a range of issues from war crimes to police and state violence to land rights. And my colleagues in Brazil, in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, Middle East and North Africa, and in the US, work very closely with communities of lawyers, of eyewitnesses, of journalists, of human rights defenders who are trying to use this intersection of tools for everything from evidence of a war crime through to community organizing to advocacy for changes in policy. That's the root of our work. And then on top of that, we think about how do you share good practices from one community to another. If you're working to create databases of police violence, what are the best practices for how to use that can be shared across communities in the US or between communities in the US and Brazil and Myanmar? How do you do that in ways that respect local knowledge but share between communities in solidarity? And then the layer that I work on at Witness, we often describe as technology threats and opportunities. And here, we're very much focused on the scaled systemic challenges that impact every single one of the people in the communities we work with, the way Facebook is structured, the opportunities that deepfakes provide to attack activists or create misinformation, the problems that footage gets taken down off YouTube that is critical war crimes evidence. And so we work to try and translate the types of challenges that are seen right now at a grassroots level or that are emerging because of technology trends into systemic early action or harm reduction in the present day around those technology problems. And that's exactly where our work on deepfakes and synthetic media fits, which is for a decade, we've seen scaled visual misinformation around the globe. And as we now look at potentially the next wave of that, which could include these so-called deepfakes, how do we make sure from this prepare, don't panic approach that the human rights voice and that the voices of communities who will be most impacted in that crisis are there from the beginning? And so that's the starting point of this work.
Great, thanks. And my next question, actually, you've already mentioned deepfakes and misinformation in synthetic media. And many academic and technical fields address issues with digital information and authenticity, which has resulted in the adoption of some of these common terms, but they have widely varying definitions. So to establish kind of a shared lexicon for our conversation, would you mind giving us your definition or your description of the following terms and maybe an idea of how we should understand the relationship among the concepts? So the terms would be synthetic media, misinformation, shallow fake, and deepfake.
Sure. So let me start with misinformation and disinformation, because this is the field that we're stepping into often when we talk about the others. So misinformation is information that is shared that is deceptive, but may not be shared with an intention to deceive you. So when someone shares a piece of anti-vaxxing information to you because they're a relative and they're trying to convince you that you might be harmed, they're sharing misinformation, but they may not be doing it with an intent to deceive you. Disinformation is the idea that people deliberately share deceptive information in order to deceive you. And people also talk about malinformation, which is when someone shares private information in order to harm you. So this is the field we often place deepfakes, shallow fakes, and synthetic media in. I'm going to push back on that a little bit as we talk as well, though, so let me come back to that. Shallow fakes is the term we use at Witness to talk about really the vast majority of ways in which people create deceptive audio-visual misinformation and disinformation. And it's something we've seen for a decade at scale. So colleagues working in Syria in the early days of the Civil War saw this. We see this in Myanmar. We see this in the US around elections. We see this in every country. And this is, shallow fakes are predominantly people miscontextualizing a piece of media, could be a photo or a video, saying it came from one context and it actually came from another context or another date. So take a picture of a burning building from one place, say it was set alight by ethnic group A, when in fact it's from place B and got set alight in a fire, but you caption it one way. Shallow fakes also includes the types of videos that we're familiar of, and people in the US and Argentina will remember how this was done with female politicians, where they slowed down Nancy Pelosi and also a prominent Argentine politician to make it look like they're physically incapacitated. So simple edits of speed or maybe just an edit. And we've called those at shallow fakes at Witness, partly because they're easy to do. Almost any of us could do it. We find an image on Google image search, change the caption, upload it. They're in contrast to what we might think of as deepfakes. And deepfakes came around starting in about 2017, the term came out. And it was coined to describe fakes that were made with an artificial intelligence process called deep learning. So deep learning is a form of machine learning, a form of artificial intelligence that enabled and has been enabling a better ability to create realistic representations of people saying, doing something they never did, or manipulations of scenes that look more realistic. And so someone just created this portmanteau of deep learning and fakes, deepfakes. The problem with deepfakes, and it's something we've really been engaging with as we talk to people about this and discuss what people fear here and what they want as solutions, is that I think deepfakes, for most people, summons up this idea, first of all, of the face swap, that We're talking about these face swaps that first came with Nicolas Cage, and then people realized they were actually mainly being used to target women with non-consensual sexual images. And it also tends to be associated with negative connotations, right? Often people think of deepfakes as being inherently negative. Synthetic media is a term that is much broader, that is often used to describe this, the range of ways you can use a range of artificial intelligence techniques to create more realistic representations of reality that never happened. And this includes a whole range of ways we can both create synthetic imagery and manipulate elements within a real image. So, I often, when I'm trying to talk to people about synthetic media, I'll talk about the range between two things they might recognize right now, like the deep nostalgia app, where you could drop in your face of your great grandmother and make her smile, right? Probably most people tried that out. It's sort of an animator photo, which is based on some research from a couple of years ago. It's a pre-trained algorithm. You drop in a single photo and it can create this simulation of movement in a photo. And at the opposite extreme is kind of the Tom Cruise TikTok deepfake, deep Tom Cruise you could find on TikTok, where it's incredibly realistic deepfake of Tom Cruise appearing to play golf and do a magic trick, was made using the face swap with a really talented impersonator with a lot of post-production. And those are kind of the two extremes of deepfakes or synthetic media. And in between, you have all these tools to do other types of manipulation. So for example, to make someone's lips match up to a soundtrack. So create what's known as a lip sync dub or sort of puppetry. Then you also have ways in which you can more easily remove objects in a scene. For example, pull out a moving object in the backdrop of a video. And then, of course, the way that a lot of people have encountered this is also the ability to create realistic photos of people who never existed, right? This person does not exist, the website you can go to, and it generates like a realistic photo of a person who never exists that represents it. So synthetic media covers all of those things, not just the sort of face swap and not just the negative usage that we often associate with deepfake.
Great. So you talked a little bit, addressed a bit about like the tools that are used to develop or create deepfakes, and obviously differential resource investment at the high end and at the low end. Could you give us maybe an idea of the prevalence of along that spectrum that you encounter in your work at Witness, based on more sophisticated versus less sophisticated deepfakes?
Yeah, so the vast majority of deepfakes in the world are non-sophisticated deepfakes made with apps. So if you've ever used Reface or Impressions or any of those apps that allow you to swap a face into a celebrity's, swap your face with a celebrity, maybe dance along in one of the kind of dance along type apps, or do a little animated GIF where you sing along with something, right? We've all done those. The vast majority of deepfakes are created in those tools, right? And those are simple app-based tools that have been trained for particular scenarios, and then essentially you're just adding one more input. Now, to use those is simple, right? And I think that's one of the big things as we look at the approach of Witness of this sort of prepare, don't panic, is a recognition that the trajectory of making it easier to create deepfakes, both at an app level and at a technical level, is getting easier, right? You need less training data. You need to train it less on specific kind of target and objects, for example, as you're transferring faces. Some areas like audio are improving really rapidly. So that sort of end, which at the moment is mainly jokey, mainly fun, is getting easier to do, requires less technical skills, less investment. And then, of course, as you move further up the scale, you are looking at more technical skills. So I gave that analogy to the Tom Cruise deepfake. That took weeks to months of work probably to make that well. It was made by a top deepfake creator, Chris Ume. Required post-production afterwards. So it's still relatively complicated and expensive to make those kinds of very effective, complete face swap deepfakes to fool someone. Now, the middle ground is where we have deeply problematic deepfakes creation, which is the scaled creation of non-consensual sexual images of women. And so, between the app side and between those incredibly well done, often comedic or parodic or political campaign deepfakes, you have a lot of deepfakes that are made of women, both women who have their face transferred into sexual images, also actresses and performers in the sex industry and who have their bodies appropriated for this. finding this is happening to them. And there were statistics from a few years ago that showed like 96% of publicly visible deepfakes were non-consensual sexual images. That figure probably has changed because there are many more like app-based, fun deepfakes out there, but that's still the middle ground. And people are using open source tools they can find. They're paying someone to do that, small amounts of money that you can do, relatively easily if you look online. So that's the sort of space. Now, what we see at Witness, we don't see that many deepfakes, and I'm really glad about this. I'm one of these people who's like, I don't want us to be in a world where we're surrounded by malicious deepfakes. I don't want to wish that world on us prematurely. Instead, we need to start, seeing what's actually happening and understand where the trends are pointing. So right now, the current problems tend to be, and I'll hope to dig more into this as we go forward, around these non-consensual sexual images that many people have had a community member targeted by, or had a similar image done with Photoshop or other forms of crude manipulation. So that definitely we see. There have not been many sophisticated, complicated deepfakes used in politics, but we're starting to see claims of something called the liar's dividend, which is where people claim that a true image is fake and cast doubt on it. And as we move forward, I'd love to talk more about that side of it as we get to threats later in the conversation, about what people name as the threats that they want solutions to aim at as this gets more prevalent.
Great. So as you mentioned political messaging and relatively low prevalence of deepfakes and political messaging, but could you maybe just give us a couple of quick, a little bit of a discussion of what types of deepfakes or some examples that you do see in political messaging?
Yeah, so there are emerging sort of deepfake approaches in political messaging. One is very strong satirical deepfake messaging. I would say the primary exponent of that is the most notable is Bruno Sartori, who's a Brazilian deepfake creator who creates these incredibly well done deepfakes of Bolsonaro, former President Lula, political figures in Brazil, often places them in soap opera context to parody their response to COVID, the rivalries between politicians. Very popular, explicitly not trying to fool you. They're parodic, they're a joke, but tapping into popular culture. In the US, we've seen examples of them being used in politics, not very successfully. Often they're much more about trying to create fear about deepfakes than any political point. There's a whole subgenre of people creating videos about deepfakes to get people scared of deepfakes, which is kind of ludicrous and rather meta. There is a very interesting political format of deepfakes that is very new and emergent, and very particular the form, these so-called resurrection deepfakes. That's when someone uses, with the consent of the family, resurrects someone to often make a political point around something that happened to them. So we saw that in Mexico. A murdered journalist was resurrected by a civil society group with his family to point out that the government still hadn't found his killer. In the US, we've had that with a young man who was killed at the Parkland shootings. And in Australia, a policeman who took his own life came back to talk about the stresses that led him to take his own life. So there are these interesting genres coming up. It's an area we've been working on a lot, is that satire is incredibly important as a deepfake format. We have a report coming out with MIT in a couple of months, but it's also the one that lends itself best to the problems we have already with gaslighting, which is a problem in mis and disinformation and attacks on public figures, where you put something out there and you say, ha, this is a joke. But it's not. It was always intended to be malicious, and you tell people they didn't get the joke when of course it was an attack or it was deceptive, harmful information. And unfortunately deepfakes play into that, and I think it's an area we're going to have to really grapple with, is the dividing lines between satire and malicious gaslighting that are enabled by this ability to create very realistic representations of reality.
Well, that's it for me. I think I'm going to pass you over to Ani's capable hands now.
Thank you, Nick.
So we're going to move into the solutions a little bit, but before we do that, I just wanted to ask which groups are most adversely affected by the expansion of synthetic media, and more generally, who are the key actors that should be involved in creating these solutions?
Thank you. So I think there's two elements we need to look at when we're looking at this, and our approach has been in Witness's work to make sure we're addressing current problems, but also really talk to people about where they see deepfakes moving in terms of threats and solutions. I would say the bedrock for Witness, and it's the way we've approached this as a process, is to say that people want to solve the deepfakes problem, but they, like many tech accountability problems, don't listen to the people who are most likely to be impacted by it, have the least voice in it. That happens obviously both within communities by people who are marginalized and excluded from power. It also happens on a global scale, right? The solutions, the perspective on deepfakes, even if you look at the rhetoric and the media around it, right? It's always about someone's going to deepfake Donald Trump, someone's going to deepfake Biden, someone's going to deepfake Boris Johnson, which is such a minimal slice of the world's population and of the ways in which these manipulative tools could be used maliciously. So our starting point has been this prepare, don't panic, but center a very human rights and global perspective in doing that. And so when I talk about threats and solutions and the actors involved, I want to name where that comes from for us. So for us, it came from bringing together communities and activists and people who are recommended to us in each of the regions where we work. So in Brazil and in sub-Saharan Africa, in the US, in Southeast Asia, we brought together groups of people with lived and expert experience of similar problems and who would likely be impacted by this. We didn't ask them to be deepfakes experts. The moment you go to people and say, do you know about deepfakes? You know, there's a fairly small slice of people who frankly are worrying seriously about this compared to every other problem we have in the world. What we instead said is, look, we're going to demystify deepfakes. We're going to demystify the hype. We're going to really talk through what people are proposing as solutions. And we want you to help us understand what you want to see as prioritized as threats. And more importantly, what you want to see prioritized as solutions. So this is not an extractive threat prioritization without agency on the solutions exercise. So that's for us really important that we constantly go back to that process of consultation to drive what we do. In terms of who's adversely impacted, right now, women, right, by non-consensual sexual images, right? That is the scale problem we have now with deepfakes. And we need to make sure that whenever we talk about deepfakes, we don't let our eyes go off the ball on misinformation completely. And that's why, Nick, when your question earlier, I pushed back on like just defining those terms, because I think then we put ourselves in a bubble that says, this is a misinformation problem versus this is a gender-based violence problem. This is a problem of driving women out of the public sphere. This is a problem around, you know, journalism and activism with very strong gendered dimensions. So women are directly affected. When we did this threat surveying globally, what we heard pretty consistently across the world were these 4 or 5 threats. First, that it would, the gender-based violence, right, because people have experienced something similar. Second, that it would be used to attack legitimate claims of video and media coming from those without power. So citizen journalism, people sharing evidence on social media. That it would intersect also with the way that power attacks people who challenge power. So I remember a very prominent participant in our South African meeting who was from a very big social movement in South Africa saying, I want to sketch the linkages here between surveillance, criminalization of civil society groups, and deepfakes, because it fits in that paradigm of trying to suppress people in power. So don't view this in abstraction, view it right in this as the way in which authoritarian and, you know, democratic societies that are failing will use this to dismiss media and to use it as part of their structure of suppressing civil society. People then linked that also to like the threat that this would overwhelm already existingly stressed journalism, fact-checking human rights groups, because they would be pressured to prove true, to continue to fight back on this. They didn't have the resources, they're already stretched. And then we also heard people really sketching out the linkages to existing types of problems that happen already, which is a lot of shallow fakes get shared in closed messaging groups. It's like an audio rumor on WhatsApp or a video or a photo in the US or in India, you know, and like, how do we deal with this existing dynamic of how this sort of digital wildfire of images and video can be shared? And they often come very context free in those settings, which makes it a lot harder to work out what they are. So those were themes people heard. When we came into the COVID pandemic, we also heard people worrying about the sort of the space of the Zoom or the online conference, and kind of like, we have this very 2D sort of encounter with people. You know, can this be compromised? How do we think about that? So, you know, people, although they recognized sort of these big like Russians and disinformation type fears, wasn't generally actually where people landed when we asked them what they thought of as the threats. So actors in the solutions, you know, I think there are who gets to prioritize the threats and the solutions and who implements them. And I think we need to very much center, and this is, you know, tough because the centrifugal force on this is to pull it towards Silicon Valley, Brussels, DC, people who will be most directly impacted within countries and globally, and make sure that's an ongoing process, right? Like, you have to keep doing this as something like deepfakes, the threat from them evolves. Who implements many of this? The solutions will come out of, and as we talk about solutions, come out of technology, and then the question becomes questions of access and equity and all those. So yeah, but I think centering, people who have the lived and expert experience from directly confronting similar problems, as opposed to viewing this as kind of a completely distinct or ruptured away as an abstract problem from what people have been experiencing for decades.
Thank you for that. And then if you can just describe what are some of the solutions to the expansion of synthetic media? And then in relation to that question, can you give us examples of how they'll work in practice? And then what burdens should be placed on social media companies in particular? And then also, how can those solutions be made accessible to people in the global south?
Yeah, so there's a range of solution areas to this, and we've done at various points map them out, and you can kind of sort of get 15 different areas, but I'm going to focus maybe on 3 or 4, like detecting deepfakes, authenticating where media come from and how it's been manipulated. So you can either show that something's been faked or show that something has been maliciously manipulated or not. Practical kind of literacy-based approaches, and then the role of institutional actors, and so I would say actually policy, legal, and platforms, because they kind of set rules, whether we like it or not, right? Like the rules are being set by that intersection of actors. So detection solutions essentially are ideas that we can, will try and detect deepfakes. And one of the things I didn't mention at the start was kind of the way in which deepfakes are generated is often within something called a generative adversarial network, which is basically setting 2 AI systems against each other. One to generate fakes, and the other to try and detect them. When the detector sees sees through a fake, the generator of the fakes then tries to generate another fake until it gets better and better. So it's like this kind of adversarial process, which means that also that detection is often adversarial, right? That that people are going to develop new methods, they're going to improve their way they generate it. They will use the detection methods you build to improve their deepfakes, right? Because they'll of course test them out. So detection, people are looking for ways to come up with detection mechanisms that will, from a technical perspective, work across different types of deepfakes. They don't just work on one, that will be, appropriate to a range of, types of settings, and, avoid, for example, bias in detection between different skin tones or other characteristics that might have inherent bias in their training data set. The problem with detection is there's a couple of problems. One is the detection community is really still grappling with how to create tools that really work well, with the type of reliability we need, and how to combine them so that you can have a set of signals, so that you don't have one perfect detector, you have a range of detectors that tell us. And this is an interesting technical problem, and there's been lots of investment put into it. The place we've been coming from at Witness, and we've been leading a series of workshops this year with the Partnership on AI, has actually been trying to understand the question of who gets access to these detection tools. Right? How do we actually make sure that the people who need them have access to them with equity, including, primarily in the global south, but also vulnerable communities, community media, human rights defenders in the US, Europe, in the global north, and Japan. So when you look at that, you have a really tough dynamic of, from the technical side, it seems like don't give people access. From the practical side, the people who are most vulnerable need access. And there was a recent case in Myanmar that I covered in an op-ed in Wired a couple of weeks ago that looked at the real challenges around this. So there was a video that came out in the early days of the coup that showed a prominent Burmese politician, very senior member of the National League for Democracy, making a statement implicating Aung San Suu Kyi, the former de facto prime minister of Myanmar, in corruption. It's a video where he's speaking to the camera, he's clearly stressed, he's clearly reading a statement, his voice sounds odd, the quality of the initial video released was very bad, and immediately people in Myanmar, not unreasonably, said this is a deepfake, right? He's been forced to say this, he's been digitally manipulated, and this is part of the kind of general deepfakes panic we have in our world, where everyone assumes there are more deepfakes than there are. It's like the military coup government has just deepfaked this political prisoner. And to corroborate that, they dropped it into an online detector. So if you look online, you'll find these detectors which say, we'll show you if it's a deepfake or not. And that deepfake came back as, or that video came back as 95% likely it's a deepfake. And so Witness is doing a lot of work in Myanmar. We were very involved in that time. I've worked with activists in Myanmar for 20 years. And I saw that very early on, people tweeting this sort of image of this politician's head surrounded by a red sort of deepfake detection box. And looking at the video, it seemed unlikely it was a deepfake. It's just a very poor quality video. He's clearly stressed, right? It's much more likely it's a forced confession, forced statement. And we took it to a number of deepfake experts. I worked with Henry Adler, another deepfake researcher. And generally our conclusion was that it wasn't a deepfake. But by the time we reached that conclusion, the story had taken hold in Myanmar that this was a deepfake, and it's still believed right now. And the reasons for this were all the reasons why it's complicated to get access to detection. People didn't have the skills in Myanmar to do this because we haven't resourced people to have skills in media forensics. The tools were unreliable, and the easiest tools were the worst. There was no easy way for people to work out who they could send it to get it checked. And it plays into this deepfake panic. So we have a real problem here, and you see it sort of captured in that story of like all the ways these elements play together to play into people's fears around media manipulation. And of course, the ability then of governments and people in power to say, well, we can't work out if anything's true. So there's a real problem in detection, which requires us to really invest actually in the skills and invest in the access to make that really work. Otherwise, we create tools that won't work for the vast majority of people who need them, particularly people who are very vulnerable in volatile situations. And this applies elsewhere. Like we could make that argument for the US as well. I'm not trying to make this into a global South, global North question. I think we could see very similar scenarios in climates of media mistrust, of distrust in authority, and lack of skills and capacity. Second area that is really important to grapple with is what's known as authenticity tools or authenticity and provenance infrastructure. What's happening here, and this is a really interesting area because about 10 years ago, groups in the human rights sector first started working on this idea, and it came out often out of like dealing with war crimes evidence that, you know, people who filmed, say, a video of a crime taking place often wanted to make sure that it was more robust as evidence, right? They wanted the metadata to be strong, showing the location and corroborating devices near them. They wanted to put what's known as a hash on it to show, so you could check whether the media had been tampered with. And so what we saw about 10 years ago was groups like Witness and the Guardian Project and the IBA building tools that basically allowed you to take photos and show and videos and show they hadn't been tampered with. And you know, about 2 or 3 years ago in the kind of misinformation sort of moment, right, our fake news moment, we started to see much more interest from mainstream technologists in this area. And it was one of the areas where fortunately a group like Witness had invested early, both building technologies, but we also, working with a Mozilla fellow, Gabby Ivans, produced a report about 2 years ago called Ticks or It Didn't Happen, which is British English for check marks or it didn't happen, which is all about the problematics of trying to create tools that claim to show you whether where a piece of media comes from and if it's been manipulated. And so it's been exciting the last couple of years. There's a lot of investment in this area. We've seen Adobe and Twitter start something called the Content Authenticity Initiative. We've seen Microsoft and Intel and ARM and Truepic and the BBC working on something called the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. And what they're trying to do is come up with a set of sort of technology infrastructure to enable people to opt in to add data to their videos and photos that enables them to say, if they want to, that they shot it, or if they want to, the location, and then indicate over time how it got edited, which of course editing is not malicious, right? We all edit our photos and videos, right? There's nothing wrong with editing, and there's nothing wrong with doing a synthetic media thing. If I want to make myself smile, in a photo or video, and it's for fun, and I tell you, that's what we do on Snap or with Adobe, with Photoshop. So this whole area has been emerging as another solution, which instead of trying to detect the manipulation, help the good actors show their work. And I think they're complementary, right? We're going to need both. And the key thing, coming back to your question about the global South and frankly the world, is how do we build an infrastructure that is a number of things? From a human rights perspective, from a perspective of people living in societies without rule of law, with disproportionate surveillance, where they don't trust the platforms, how do we make sure these systems are not built for assumptions that you need to share your identity, that you can't redact information to protect yourself, are not built on assumptions about technology that are not relevant to places that don't have heavy levels of mobile broadband or older devices, right? So there's technology questions, there's privacy questions. And then also, how do we really be careful about not making this a tool that either gives you a too easy sort of check mark to say this is, you should trust this, versus saying, here's a set of signals and information about this media, this is what's happened to it, you need to make a decision about how this helps you trust it. So we're not telling people this is a signal of truth, we're giving people signals to help them understand media with this type of tool. And then, of course, we want to be really careful these tools aren't abusable by governments who are passing all these fake news laws globally that are doing things like say, you need journalistic identity, we need to be able to know who created media. Otherwise, we create a double-edged sword, right? We create the tools for people to be able to show their work, to indicate that they created something, but we also create the risks that those infrastructure that enables those tools can be used to track civilians, to enforce rules on freedom of expression. So those are the two big technical solution areas. I think they plug into media literacy, which is one of these bugbear words that people always say. They say, we need more media literacy. And there was a fabulous talk by Dana Boyd a few years back at South by Southwest, where she talked about this sort of bugbear word of media literacy and the problems with using it, because media literacy can mean everything from like this instinct to kind of burrow down and like find the conspiracy as one frame on it, versus actually like trying to rise above the conspiracy and think sort of laterally about whether, say, a piece of media encountered makes sense, right, in terms of its context. And so when it comes to deepfakes, we don't do a lot of training to people to spot deepfakes. We actually tend to focus like how tools like detection or authenticity can fit into much simpler frameworks that are relevant to deepfakes and shallow fakes. So one we use at Witness is the SIFT framework that was developed by the media literacy practitioner and academic Mike Caulfield, that applies to almost any type of media, which is stop, investigate the source, find alternative coverage, trace the origin, which is a very simple way of basically sort of pausing, making sure that you're looking to see if other people have covered the same piece of media. Is there another video, another photo, another story? Finding alternative coverage, and then looking back to see if this is the original, which often applies to shallow fakes, right? Because these are typically just someone recycling a video or a photo. My colleagues in the Africa team at Witness are currently starting a pilot that's really aimed at how do we translate these types of skills to kind of community level. We describe them as misinfo and disinfo medics. So rather than focusing at kind of the professional fact checker level or trying to go to every individual person, how do we really invest in kind of human rights leaders and others to have the skill sets to be the people who get access to deepfake detection tools or other ones if they become relevant down the line. So I think media literacy important, but we need to get away from the kind of idea that you just need to look really closely at the pixels and you're going to be able to spot it as an individual. Just hopeless. We should never be telling people to do that. It just doesn't work. And then platforms and policy and legal. There's a lot of institutional power around deepfakes held by those the three areas there, I guess. Platforms. Deepfakes are an interesting area because they're not that prevalent on our social media platforms yet. And you see the platforms kind of grappling with their policies. About 18 months ago, a lot of them created policies, and we brought some of their proposed policies to some of the work we did, the convenings we did, we got feedback and pushed that back to the platform. So very actively, as they've set policies, we've tried to influence them. I think a lot of deepfake policies at the moment sort of are focused on its rarity. So it's like, Facebook has a policy that says if it's a type of manipulation that would be indiscernible to a human, that they take extra care on it. And that reflects something that we've emphasized, which is actually that, until people really know how often they should expect deepfakes, until we have better detection tools, there's a stronger bias to tell people when there's no reason they should know that it could have been faked, right? So, you have to understand where your audience of your platform is at. Most platforms have aimed at, I think, probably the right intersection policy-wise of kind of the combination of deceptive, malicious, and harmful, right? Like if you look at how Twitter handles it, it's like that's when they take the most action. Now, the problem is, of course, the same problem as with any of these platforms and how they work globally. So there's the deepfakes problem, which is it's hard to detect deepfakes. So actually, it's not as easy just to expect a platform just to like ping, 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 detect them. And then the second is the problems of how well they're going to enforce content moderation rules globally. And I think we're going to come back to that later, I hope, as an area where it's like actually, you can have a great platform policy, but if they don't know how to implement, they haven't resourced it. How's that going to work? It's early days on the legal side. I think we're starting to see, at a state level in the US, you have laws that tend to focus on three areas, like trying to include these non-consensual synthesized images in existing laws against revenge porn and other things. And there's others that tend to focus on like election periods. And then there's a few that are starting to deal with some of the new issues, right? Like a new issue that came into the headlines a few weeks ago was, and sort of probably in a funny way, the way that most people thought about deepfakes in the last 6 months was these few synthetic lines in an Anthony Bourdain documentary where the filmmaker made Anthony Bourdain say some lines from an email in a synthetic audio voice. And that's an area that, in fact, legally people have been grappling with. So New York State has been looking at kind of how do you have control over your sort of digital likeness after death? What are your rights? So we're starting to see these legal discussions around kind of likeness rights, around, where we really clamp down on this. I think actually there's a far broader discussion we need to have, and it's something Witness has been working with others around, actually codes of ethics and norms. And I don't say that because I want to have lightweight things. I say that because I think there's a lot of people who probably are never going to be covered at this stage by laws, right? Like some of these app manufacturers who are looking more for the guardrails, like how do we make sure that we're including consent and disclosure if we release synthetic media, like get consent from the people who's manipulated? How do we disclose in an appropriate way that something has been manipulated, right, to the audience? And I actually don't think we need a lot of laws right now. I think we're very early, and there's always a danger that if you don't know what the problem looks like, you legislate for the problem that you imagined. And I think that's, there's all kinds of historical precedents for why we shouldn't do that. So the focus at the moment is right. And actually a lot of where we've been focusing as Witnesses, like what are the norms we expect of content producers, of the people who build apps, of the people who create media policies at a major media entity about what they're going to share and use.
Thank you for that. I'll pass it over to Aya now.
Thanks,
Sani. So moving on, I'd now like to discuss with you the role that international human rights law might play in this conversation. So could you please start us off by explaining what the relevant international human rights law standards are that apply to misinformation and synthetic media?
Yeah, so I think the place, in this, I'm going to draw on the work that the human rights and digital rights community has been doing over the past 5 or 6 years. And, I think really Witness has been very actively involved in that alongside many others, trying to think, how do we think about human rights and how does that apply particularly to the types of mediums and media that we work with, like video. But it includes work like the Santa Clara Principles, talking about number, notice, and appeal, right, around content moderation, includes the work of former Special Rapporteur David Kay, really pushing this work at the international, at the UN level. So this is an area where it's been exciting to see like this sort of push to have human rights be part of content moderation, and then of course in the work that we think about this area. Though I should say Witness more broadly really focuses on content moderation, because of course if you imagine those communities we work with, they are constantly facing these challenges of individual videos being taken down or videos kept up that create hate speech or harm, or massive amounts of evidence being taken down, as we've seen from YouTube in contexts like Syria and others. So we definitely view this as Witness from a broader lens of content moderation. I think when it comes to synthetic media and we start with the sort of freedom of expression principles and kind of the way that human rights jurisprudence has developed around this. And so, part of that is really trying to say, if you create a policy around this, be it as a government or as a business that's following UN guiding principles and trying to respect human rights and follow those principles, you've in human rights law and, developed over time, we have this sort of 3-pronged principle about, when it's okay to restrict speech, right? And so, you have a prong that's kind of legality, right? Like, have you explained clearly what you're doing? And so if, for example, we're going to decide we want policies either in law and in legislation or at platforms, we should demand a lot of clarity about what they're actually looking for. Are they looking for deepfakes, or are they looking for malicious media that is manipulated by AI, or are they looking for malicious media that's manipulated in any way we care about? We should be clear what we're trying to define in terms of this, and and then are we doing it for a legitimate reason? Right? There's a legitimacy prong in freedom of expression jurisprudence, which is like, are you doing this to protect public health? Right? Clear rationale for a lot of COVID work, for national security, a few other things that are stated there. And not, and this comes up actually around satire and parody. And I remember we had a tremendous intervention in a web series that Witness ran last year called Deepfakery on satire from Professor Evelyn Aswad, who's at the University of Oklahoma, really talking about these parameters, and one of the things she's mentioned in conversation is, national security doesn't mean parodying a leader, right? Which is what people do, right? Like, and of course, in many contexts, authoritarian contexts, parodying your leader is considered a national security issue. That is not under international human rights law. So that very prominent use of deepfakes is absolutely acceptable in a human rights context. Of course, within other parameters, there might be other reasons, but it's not because of that. And then the third is kind of the necessity and proportionality, right? Is this approach to it going to be one that is what are the alternatives we can have here that minimize reducing speech, in terms of, do we have to censor it? Can we reduce its visibility? Can we provide more context on it? And for example, when we reviewed the Twitter principles around manipulated media at one of the meetings we held in sub-Saharan Africa, I remember one observation people had there were like, please don't remove all this media. We want to be able to have it there so we can respond to it, right? Like our ability to have a dialogue with it. Now, people aren't saying that about media that is directly inciting hate. And I think we've got an intersection here between freedom of expression, of course, knowing the harms that can be created by synthetic media. And so that's a navigation that it's really important the platforms be listening to. But as a top line around policies around, manipulated media, starting with those sort of freedom of expression principles, is a good place to start.
Great, thanks, Sam. So as you mentioned, the spread of misinformation and synthetic media can raise some pressing issues for content moderation, which I want to dig into a bit further. And so over the past few years, social media companies have slowly begun to adopt content moderation policies that aim to regulate misinformation specifically. For instance, in its community guidelines, Facebook has a rule telling its users not to post, quote, misinformation and unverifiable rumors that contribute to the risk of imminent violence or physical harm, unquote. And Twitter has a policy prohibiting its users from spreading false or misleading information about COVID-19. And so given these developments, I wanted to ask you a few questions. Firstly, how should the international human rights law standards that you just spoke about apply to content moderation policies in practice? Secondly, should the international human rights law framework inform the way social media companies design their AI detection tools? And if so, in what way? And finally, I was wondering if the international human rights law framework might help social media companies in demarcating a line between the non-nefarious uses of synthetic media, which we presumably want to protect fiercely under the right to freedom of expression, and the nefarious uses of synthetic media, which we probably would want social media companies to have a bit more discretion in restricting.
There's a lot packed in there. Let me try and, so I think that actually that first part is a big part of why we want to think about this. Non-nefarious uses of synthetic media are 99% of synthetic media, or will be 99%, right? Like, and again, this goes back to Nick's question at the start, like synthetic media is emerging into all kinds of environments, like it's in news production, to have your synthetic weather avatar, it's in commercial training videos, it's in your videos you create on TikTok and Snap and Instagram, right? Like synthetic media is there. And 99% of that is non-malicious, and certainly shouldn't be taken down unless it's breaching some other thing, right? It's is it inciting hate? Is it creating deceptive harm? I think the place I would focus in the discussion around content moderation, there's a couple of them. I think in general those policies you described are actually pretty good policies, right? They kind of start to tread the line we're talking about around legality, legitimacy, proportionality, necessity, right? They're not going to do this. We've also seen some, I think, very smart moves to think about how the power of the speaker also has influence, right? So deciding about bans or temporary or longer term bans on speakers. A lot something we've argued from a witness for a long time is that, your power of the speaker is incredibly important in terms of the harm it can create, right? So, we're starting to see these rules. I think the problem is probably in two areas that we see most concretely in the witness context. One is we're barely scratching the surface of the kind of types of things in the Santa Clara principles, which are this numbers notice appeal, which is basically a recognition that we still don't really know what's going on. We don't understand the algorithms. We don't know how they're making their decisions. It's not opaque. When it goes wrong, they often don't tell people. We hear this all the time from people we work with saying, the video came down, I have no idea why it is, they don't know who to talk to, and there's no appeal, right? So this is a very opaque system that makes mistakes all the time, and that doesn't allow that. So that part of the side of it is completely not there, right, yet, has not arrived. The second part is what advocates globally and many of the leading advocates have spoken about who are working in national context around the world is the question of resourcing cultural competency and investment to be able to make these contextual decisions like the one that you're describing about Twitter, right? How do you make that in If you don't have the staff, you haven't resourced it adequately, you're not listening to local civil society. And, we saw that recently in Nigeria around some videos that my colleague highlighted to a platform, and it's clear that there was not enough capacity to know whether these videos were harmful, know whether they were satirical, know whether they should stay up or down. And that's just frankly a money and resourcing question and a respect question from platforms. So you can have good policies, but if you don't have those, you create real harms globally. We could name those situations in pretty much every country. So I think that those two are actually where I would point to, is it's less actually about the policies, which in theory are actually pretty, like the Twitter one, pretty human rights principles respecting. It's about the back end of what they do with it. It's about the resourcing globally. And then of course it's the underlying labor question of, forcing people to watch endless videos in the content moderation industry. Where it applies to detection tools, super interesting question. Like, I think there's a couple of places. One is probably around non-discrimination. You want to make sure, of course, you build tools that don't reflect, one of the pervasive problems in AI, which is bias in the training data. That could cut both ways, right? Like, you could argue that much as in the case of facial recognition, where many Black activists who pointed to how facial recognition is failing, doesn't work well, or facial identification doesn't work well, might also be part of the movement that says we don't want to improve facial recognition. In fact, we want to ban it, right? So for synthesis, I can imagine there are perspectives that say, let's not improve the training data to create, synthetic images, because this is going to be abused and disproportionately be used to attack the lives and livelihoods of people who are already threatened or vulnerable. So it is complication in that improving the training data. One thing that was noticed about a recent deepfake detector training program was that it didn't function so well on a variety of skin tones, right? So it was biased towards detecting better individuals with lighter skin tones. So I think there's AI issues there in the training data, but that's complicated. And then there are issues around kind of, who benefits from these tools if they're created. So where's the training data coming from, and then who benefits, which go back to those deepfake detection equity. How are we making sure as we build these tools, if the training data is endless images that are sourced from people who had no consent or no real role in understanding that, are we ensuring there's a diversified input access to those tools as they come out? The final thing I'd say is that, as we look at authenticity infrastructure, we want to be really careful we don't place that into automated systems without caution, right? Like, these signals are much better read manually. They are imperfect signals that tell you about media, because we have, a whole slew of problems that have emerged around automated content moderation, about hash database and things like that. So there are issues we have to be very cognizant of in that space as well.
Great, thanks for your take on those questions. And now, aside from the implications raised by the spread of misinformation in synthetic media for the right to freedom of expression, as you mentioned, there are also implications for the right to non-discrimination, because as you're just talking about, AI can be biased. And so if we rely on AI detection systems to detect synthetic media, and those decisions end up being biased, that in and of itself is an issue. And so do you think there's a workaround solution to bias in AI? And if not, whether you think all content moderation decisions should be made by a human? And if you do believe that, I just wanted to flag that humans can be biased as well. So what would make a human-made decision better or more justifiable, if at all, than a decision generated by AI?
Yeah. In some ways, I have an easier answer to this question around deepfakes and synthetic media than other areas, because I think the deepfake detection tools are not adequate to make a decision. They're signals at the moment that need to be read by a human to be reliable in any kind of important contextual decision. And similarly, the authenticity tools aren't designed to give a yes, no, they're designed to give a set of signals. And I think that does lend itself to thinking about the intersection. I think it's reasonable to recognize that automation provides signals and that AI provides signals. It's where that human layer comes in and how it's accountable, how it's resourced, what context it has, and then once it makes a decision, do you then have at the back end this transparency, this appeals, this due process, this way to do this? And of course, there's the whole thing structured in international human rights principles. But in a strange way, for me at least, deepfakes is not yet at the stage where it really feeds into, like, this could be completely automated. We just don't have that capacity yet.
Great, thank you so much. So now I'm going to shift over to questions from the chat. We only have one question as of right now, but if any audience members do have any remaining questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And so we have a question here from Ziad Borat, who says, I've been quite interested in something Francis Fukuyama and Andrew Grotto have written recently, that there exists among the tech social media giants the paradoxical outcome wherein the platform's ability to restrict speech on behalf of a foreign authoritarian government is actually protected constitutionally from US government regulation. How do we resolve this effectively given these platforms' global growth ambitions?
Goodness, I haven't read that article. It sounds interesting. So I'm going to give more of a response just generally that I think there is a real tension right now around kind of control of platforms and when platforms have to enforce the say of governments. I think we're seeing it play out in Nigeria right now around Twitter. And there is a dynamic that I think we, from a global perspective, and point to, and I would say disinformation scholars as well who are coming from outside the US, like Jonathan Corpus-Ong, have pointed to this, that in the US discussion, there's an over focus often on like the role of platforms as a bad actor in this space. When in fact, if you look at disinformation, if you look at like structural actions, we should be paying attention to the actions of governments, right? Like a range of Southeast Asian governments, what are they doing in terms of, you know, imposing fake news laws that are in fact about authoritarian control, that are about banning speech. So I'm going to read into the question and make sure I go and look at the article afterwards, a little bit of actually how we pay attention to the power of government. I think from a perspective that's of people who work on this who are often grounded in the US, they tend to focus very much on the tech accountability, and we shouldn't take our eyes off what Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Google and the others should be doing. But in fact, as a dynamic of like real power, government legislation and particularly sort of fake news laws globally are a more dynamic element, and potentially also governments as agents of disinformation within those systems, a more dynamic agent than we anticipate.
All right, seeing as we don't have any other questions in the chat, I'll just go ahead and ask another question if you don't mind. So related to the issue of misinformation, disinformation, synthetic media, and so forth, is the issue of confirmation bias, which describes the tendency to prefer information that confirms one's preconceptions or prior held beliefs and values. And so I was wondering if there are any solutions currently in existence to overcoming confirmation bias, and if not, what you would envision to try and overcome confirmation bias?
Goodness, that's a last 3-minute question that scholars have been working on for a long time. I think on that one, I'm actually going to point to a demonstration in the deepfakes world of this that came from a piece of research, I think last year, that, you know, was really trying to help people sort of spot deepfakes and showing them a series of like videos with impersonators and deepfakes. And I'm going to oversimplify it, but one of the main conclusions of the paper was that people's ability to detect basically aligned with whether it confirmed their existing biases. So like our ability to detect is compromised by our confirmation bias or our bias to, you know, to anticipate whether something is faked because of its either similarity or difference from our confirmed political position. I think deepfakes, you know, will be deployed likely in many similar ways that people deploy shallow fakes, which is, you know, Mike Caulfield, the practitioner I was talking about earlier, talks about kind of trope field as a way of understanding sort of shallow fakes, which is basically like there are all these existing frames that people have for what they expect to happen in a scenario. And really it's super easy then to sort of plug in any video. You just go and find the video or photo in any given day that fits that sort of trope field as he describes it. And you saw that in the US elections around, like, you know, people finding a video or a photo that appeared to show, you know, ballot manipulation. And that's simply, they've got an established, as he describes it, trope field, and they're dropping in, they just look for the video or photo that fits it. You don't need to tell the narrative. People instantly recognize it as the narrative they have in their head. And I think that is particularly powerful visually. I think there's a real problematic with visual misinformation because it just clicks for us. Unfortunately, that happens with shallow fakes as well as deep fakes.
Great, thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of our time together. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us in this conversation. And thank you to all of the audience members who attended. Our final event in the Global Digital Rights Challenges series will be in 2 weeks on Thursday, August 12th. And in that event, Sophia Noble and Tawana Petty will discuss facial recognition and entrenching racial discrimination. So please join us for that event. Thanks again.